Hey guys, welcome back to r/entitledpeople. In this video, a ridiculous construction company mistakenly demolished my entire property and then thought that I would not retaliate against them. Well, think again. Here is what I did. The first one is titled, I was dared to call the police. So to set the scene, I had minor surgery in the morning, kidney stones are not fun, and decided that it would probably be best to Uber to an appointment instead of driving. For most of the Uber drive, everything goes relatively peacefully. We're about 2 minutes out and everything has been going as expected. Well, what I was not expecting was for some roided up stress head in a 4WD to have an insecure masculinity meltdown. Traffic is a little backed up and my Uber driver does an socially frowned upon but not illegal maneuver as we are stopped to let turning traffic have unrestricted access to a side road. Not something we have to do as it's not an actual intersection. Uber driver notices that the guy in the right lane has done the same because the gap in front of him is too small for his giant 4WD. aka four-wheel drive vehicle. She indicates takes that opening and then is immediately honked at by the four-wheel drive guy. She looks confused at me and asks if she did anything wrong. I shook my head. We are approaching the lights that caused the backup and our emotionally stunted four-wheel drive owner speeds violently into the lights right-turning lane, screaming at us through his car, giving us the finger. The works. I laugh and the Uber driver ignores it. However, as we continue up to the lights going straight on, four-wheel drive owner slams his four-wheel drive into the straight lane with no warning or indication and slams his brakes on. It is worth noting that this was done at a well-surveilled set of lights. He is in front of us and brake checks us again as we cross over the lights and then he turns off onto the next side street, and the side street I was going to get my Uber driver to drop me off. I get her to go one street further up and U-turn so as to not antagonize the clearly angry driver and give him time to get ahead. She agrees, does the U-turn and then turns onto the side street. Well, guess what is at the entrance to the street? The four-wheel drive guy. My eyes roll into the back of my head as I realize there's a pretty solid likelihood this dude is going to come over and try and abuse us. The Uber driver drops me off and asks nervously, "Do you want me to hang around?" But I shake my head. I get my phone out and hit record just in case, and sure enough, as my first steps down the street happen, Mr. I purchase large cars to make up for deficiencies elsewhere is coming over. He is Greek or Lebanese, I can tell right away. The clothes, the annoyed strut, the glasses, the skin tone. Sure enough, he starts right away being verbally aggressive and his accent confirms my suspicions. For 8 minutes I let him go, complaining all about her driving, but when I bring up his own actually illegal actions saying, "So what?" he tells me he does not care if I'm recording, does the short man syndrome thing of entering my personal space and calling me tough because I'm big, and telling me how hard he is for doing 4 years in prison, and then makes a fatal mistake. He tells me to call the cops. So I do. He is standing there riled up, a mixture of nervous and self-righteous energy. Except that I tell the police immediately that I arrived at the location via an Uber and was being harassed. When I mention the word Uber, his head tilts, and when I explain his actions as well as him admitting to them on camera, he looks surprised and then concerned, and then he runs to his car, but not before I can relay to the operator his license plate. Police arrive later and I show them the video footage of the altercation. I did not think anything serious would happen, most likely just a fine unless he had done this kind of thing before. Turned out he had done worse. He had been involved in a non-fatal hit and run where the police were only able to get a description of the vehicle and of the driver. He was sentenced just last week, 6 months, not much as it was his first offense. At least now when he tells folks that he has spent time in prison, he won't actually be lying. And here, Ripe Stars, I gotta say, no offense to people who drive big vehicles like pickup trucks and stuff, but I'm curious if this phenomenon is the same in the US and other countries as it is in Thailand. So one advice I can give you if you ever spend some time in Thailand and get the idea of driving on the road here, there's especially 2 types of drivers you need to be very aware of. First is pickup truck drivers, especially the ones that kind of have screwed up vehicles already, and minivan drivers. Almost without exception, these types of drivers will always drive extremely aggressive and extremely stupid. I mean, honestly for me, driving in Thailand is not really a big deal despite it being called like the most dangerous roads in the world. However, you do have to be really careful, especially when you drive on the right lane of the road. That is basically the lane that is reserved for fast drivers, and this lane can really be merciless. Since there are no real speed limits in Thai cities, at least nothing is enforced, people drive as fast as they want even though it's not that fast, and if you're not fast enough for them, they will almost push you off the road. Basically, if you're driving too slowly, they will come up as close as they can to you to basically pressure you to change the lane. It's really something you have to get used to here. Anyway, let's switch to the title story, which is titled "Construction Company Mistakenly Demolished My House." And by the way, please don't forget to like the video and maybe even post a comment because that would help me tremendously. Thank you so much. The phrase "home is where the heart is" has always resonated with me because it is just true. My house was always the epicenter of every holiday and celebration. It was my family's haven for decades. My parents bought the home from my grandparents when I was just a girl. When they wanted to move to a smaller place for their retirement, I purchased it from them, so I had the gift of raising my own children in the very house that I had grown up in. The old house had been in my family for so long that it seemed to be a member of the family in its own right. The stairs groaned and creaked like an old man. There was a gentle wave from the curtains when we threw open the windows after the brief Alabama winters that always made it look like the house was breathing a sigh of relief. Every beam and board in that house was imbued with a special magic that comes from years of love and memories. Our home had been a place to return to for generations. It was steady, stable and familiar, like an old friend. I never expected to have to say goodbye to my own home. I always assumed I would sell or gift it to one of the children like my parents had to me. That is why I decided to invest in fixing a few of the less charming parts of the old house. I'd updated the bathrooms myself and hired a friend to help me bring the kitchen into the modern age. I was so excited about all the updates, but living in a construction zone is not for me. That's why during the long renovation, I was staying at my sister's house. That is why when my friend called me at work and said, "Is that your house on TV?" I was completely confused. "My house?" I asked. "I think so," they said. "Turn on channel 2. Hurriedly, I switched on the television and navigated to the local news. It was showing a story about a car accident, so I knew I would have to wait for the stories to loop. I sat in nervous anticipation for 5 minutes until the anchor said, "A local construction company is starting to work on a park in Cherry Valley." Whatever he said next was lost on me because all I could hear was my heart pounding in my ears. The screen showed my beloved family home in shambles. The entire house was demolished and lying in pieces on the ground. My heart broke. Every sweet memory I ever made in that house seemed to be lying in pieces on the ground next to the broken wood and tiles. My grief overwhelmed me and I sat on the floor and wept. I could barely wrap my head around what they had done, let alone how or why. The construction crew on the television had parked a bulldozer in front of the wreckage. The name on the side of the dozer read Miller's Construction. Even in my grief-addled state, I knew that their name would come in handy, so I wrote it down and I was still more depressed than I could put into words, but now I had a mission. It was revenge. I knew it would hurt, but before I could go any further, I had to see the house for myself. I drove down to the property and there it was, a miserable pile of rubble set where my home had once been. Luckily, I had all my large furniture in storage at the time, but among the wreckage I found pieces of old picture frames and a box containing broken pieces of my grandmother's wedding china. Seeing all the broken pieces was like looking at a car crash. It was gross, but I could not look away. So much love and so many memories were contained in that house, and now they were just trash scattered on the ground. I spent an hour picking through the pile that once had been my home before I called the cops. By the time they arrived, my eyes were so red from crying that it was a wonder I could even see them at all. "Hello, officer," I said. "Afternoon," he answered. "What do we have here?" I explained everything to him, from the construction to the phone call to the news report. "And you did not authorize this demo?" he asked. "No, sir," I said. "Give me just a moment to call the station and the city's zoning director. Maybe I can get a little more information for you," he said. Thank you. The officer went back to their patrol car and made some calls. So, he said upon his return, I was able to reach the city zoning director. And they do have a park project in this area. No, in my yard they don't, I said. Correct. They are supposed to be demoing and building one lot over from here. However, the zoning guy says that his construction crews never make errors like this, the cop said. Well, they did here, I said angrily. Yes, it seems they did. He also said for some reason records about what construction company was contracted to work here are missing. Missing? He said. Does this all seem a little fishy? I asked. Yes, very. Do you have any more information? He asked. I told him about Miller's construction. That's a good lead. Why don't I stop by the office and ask some questions? He said. Thank you, I said. A few hours later, the officer called me and explained that he was able to find the foreman for this job. The man seemed genuinely upset about the house being demoed. He said it was a true and honest mistake made by a new employee. But that does not restore my house, I said miserably. No, unfortunately it doesn't, and it also leaves you with limited legal options, he said. Since it was a real accident, we cannot press charges. If you want to pursue damages from Miller's construction, you will have to do so with a civil lawsuit. For the second time that day, I was completely devastated. Someone admitted to destroying my family's home, and all I could do was sue them? Well, fine, I thought, I will sue. I spent the next week organizing with family and friends. It was a horrible time, but it was nice to see so many of my loved ones rally around the family. They helped me find a lawyer who specialized in civil damages, and we started to put together a case. The lawyer sent a summons to the construction company, and their lawyer replied with a form letter saying that they were not responsible. I was furious. It was one thing to make a mistake, but another to try to ignore it completely. Before then, I had mixed feelings about the lawsuit, but after that letter, I was sure that we were heading down the right path. A trial date was set. The weeks before the trial were full of stress and anticipation. At night I could not sleep because of anxiety and depression. During the day I was like a ghost, there but not really present. Whether the construction crew made a mistake or not, the toll they had exacted on my life was very real. When the trial finally arrived, I was nervous but also happy, because it was the closest thing to closure that I would get here. My lawyer was presented a clear and persuasive case. They laid out the facts. The construction company was ordered to demo another property, but accidentally demolished my home. The individual operating the equipment was a trainee, my family home and several heirlooms were destroyed. Hearing it all so plainly in court was painful, but worth it because in the end the evidence was overwhelming. And finally, the judge ruled in my favor. They ordered the construction company to repay the financial damages, legal fees, and an extra stipend to cover the ongoing therapy I now needed thanks to the emotional turmoil they had caused. Additionally, the construction company was barred from taking any civic contracts for 2 years. Every one of their employees now has to undergo training on how to properly clear and secure a site before demolition. Up until the trial, I'd felt like someone had driven a bulldozer right through my heart. That day, it all turned around. I was not happy, I'd still lost my home, but I was at least relieved. The ordeal was over, and I could start to pick up the pieces from here. The penalties for the construction company would be enough to set me up with a new place, and hopefully the training would ensure that they never did this to someone else again. And well, by Christmas I had moved into a new house. It did not have quite as much character as the old one, but it's still a home. My family came from all around for the first holiday in the new house, and it was magical. The familiar warmth from the old house followed us here. We finished the night with a family photo, but just before the shutter was snapped, I made everyone wait. I ran into my room and grabbed a framed photo of the old house. I held the picture as we all posed for the photo outside my new house. Now, every time I walk through my front hall, I'm greeted by that photo, and it's a beautiful reminder of the legacy that house represented. It might not be there, but we still are, and we will build back stronger. And yeah, Ripe Stars, honestly, that construction company is a complete mess, and I really hope that they will never do this to anyone else again. The people working there must be some of the dumbest people in existence, honestly. Anyway, the next one is titled "Bully Me for over 2 months and people from all over the country ensure justice." Posted by user MOFHDJE on r/Ripe Stories, which is our own subreddit where you can post your own stories and I might read them in a video. Anyway, this all started about a year and a half ago. I, 26 female / 25 at this time, am a night owl and I'm usually awake half the night. I'd signed a new cell phone contract just a few months ago and accepted a new cell phone number as a fresh start. In my old country, old cell phone numbers are reassigned after 3 to 6 months, depending on the provider. That is why it wasn't too strange when a woman called me in the middle of the night 2 to 3 months after my new contract. She wanted to know who I was, but I didn't go into too much detail. I explained to her that she probably got the wrong person and that I have not had the number for that long. She then hung up and I mistakenly assumed that was the end of it. Well, the next call came the next day. Here, she explained to me that she really wanted to know who I was because she had my number from her husband's cell phone. My number is saved there without a name. Here, I went through several options with her, whether he lived nearby or whether I could have had contact with him through work. Her husband works in a completely different field than me and comes from a city that is on the exact other side of the country. So I explained to her that her husband had saved the number of the person who previously had my cell phone number. Here I thought again that it was over. However, a few days later she called me again and claimed that I was her husband's affair and insulted me endlessly. I then reassured her and explained to her again about reassignment of cell phone numbers and that I did not know her or her husband. This was followed by a long conversation in which I gave her advice regarding her mistrust of her husband and encouraged her to speak to him directly about it. And yes, I'm a people's pleaser. Anyway, she thanked me warmly and with that I thought it was finally over again. Days later there was an angry call with violent insults that I was a liar and much more. Here it was too much for me and my tone became even more clear. We agreed that we would block each other's phone numbers and that she would solve her problems by herself. I was really sure that it would end now, but after 1 to 2 weeks I received dozens of voicemail messages. A look at the caller list showed me that she tried to call me over 50 times during the last 2 days. She left me 13 voicemail messages, 5 of which threatened me violently and insulted me. I wrote her a text message in which I explained to her again, in writing, that she should leave me alone because I didn't know her or her husband and that I will take legal action against her if she doesn't stop. Well, after more voicemail messages and calls from her from other numbers, I went to the police and filed a report. After all, the whole thing had been already going on for 2 months. 2 weeks later, it became quiet, only 1 to 2 attempted calls in the caller list. 6 months later, the complaint was dropped because it was a minor offense and related to her personal stressful situation. Apparently, my stressed situation didn't count. I did not really have the money for a lawyer to take action against her otherwise, but here is my revenge. So I couldn't leave it like that, bullied, insulted and threatened for 2 months, so I talked to my Discord friends about it. Our solution: 17 people across the country posted her phone number on dating flyers, club bathroom doors, passed them on to friends, and I entered her number into all of the online competitions. According to friends, the number has not assigned anymore since 2 weeks. And yeah, ripe stars, that is certainly a valid way of getting revenge on someone that wronged you. Either way, thank you so much for posting the story, and as mentioned before, if you want to post your own story, you are very welcome to do so either in the comments or for longer stories, post them on r/ripestories on Reddit. And now let's move on to the next story. It starts like this. I live in Eastern Europe and at one point the neighborhood I lived in seemed to form a kind of group. I don't really have a good name for it and it's very similar to the HOAs in other countries that I will call it that. The biggest difference of it being that I believe HOAs are sanctioned while things here seem to be a little bit new and wild with no clear lines. I'm not one to jump into new things, especially that look a little off, so I declined joining, which really upset the leader, who I will call HOA president. I noticed that one thing he would do once a home joined was use his power to control pretty much everything about them. He wanted a certain percentage of their income and free access to use their land as he wanted. It all felt very off to me, which is another reason I wanted nothing to do with it, but that did not stop him from constantly asking me to join. I wanted nothing to do with him and told him so several times over about an 8-month period. My wife got sick and she needed to go to the hospital. We don't exactly live near one, so we had to go to the nearest city and I stayed there with my wife. At first I went back to the farm a couple of times, but the time and money to travel did not make any sense. Combining that with my wife getting sicker instead of better made my decision for me. I would have somebody feed my animals and I would just stay at the hospital with my wife as long as the staff let me without making me go to a hotel to sleep and eat something. After about 3 weeks, it was clear to everybody that nothing was helping and she was just slowly dying. At that point, nothing could make me leave her hospital room and I stayed there until the very end. She was only 40 and I was 42, so I figured we had a lot more good years together. That we would grow old on the farm, so I was inconsolable that she had passed away. We never had kids and without her, I felt like I was alone and did not have anybody. I know that this part of the story seems like a totally different story, but while I was in the city and hospital, the HOA president was doing something to my property. I came home and just wanted to mourn, but instead found that my land had a fence right down the middle of it. I could still access my home, but the area with my animals, my shed, and an area with a small garden and a chair were no longer accessible. I was actually mostly angry about the last thing because it was my wife's favorite spot to sit and read, so the fact that I couldn't get near it got me very upset. To answer why I did not just jump the fence, the answer was that it was an electric fence and if I touched it, I would get shocked. I got into contact with the man I put in charge of my animals to see what the hell happened while I was gone. He was for all intents and purposes in charge and should have stopped this from happening. He told me how the HOA president came and built the electric fence and nothing he was saying or doing was making him stop. That the HOA president claimed he actually owned half of my land and trespassing on it would be illegal and he would get hurt by the fence. I did not want to take my frustration out on him because he was my friend and I tried his best to handle things. Plus, I did tell him not to contact me while I was in the hospital and he obeyed that wish. I went over to the HOA president and started yelling at him instead for stealing half my land and fencing it off so I could not get to any of my things. In my rage with him barely getting to speak, I learned only 2 things that I cared about. The first was that he was feeding the animals, so at least I didn't need to worry about them starving. The second thing was that he claimed the HOA owned that half of the land, and he fenced it off to make sure that it was safe until he could transform it into something else. Looking back, I wish that I had just punched him in the face in that moment. I would have gotten in trouble, but it would have been worth it. I chose chaos and that I was gonna get on my land one way or another. I spent hours researching safe ways to get through the electric fence and although I did it, I would not recommend it. It was dangerous and you could easily get hurt. I went right to my wife's chair and sat down until HOA president showed up and saw me. He was furious that I damaged the fence and was on what he considered to be his property. He called the cops on me and wanted me arrested for trespassing despite the fact that it was my property. They asked me if I would leave and I told them no. They had no idea who was telling the truth, but they believed him instead of me and escorted me off the property. I then finally contacted a lawyer and started a lawsuit against him and his dumb organization for stealing my land and keeping me off of it. Without my wife, I really had nothing to lose and everything to gain. I did not care about anything else aside from my farm and he couldn't do anything to hurt me more than I already was. He did not have anything to show the land was his while I had records of the farm being bought and where the lines were from that. The only thing he had was claiming that since I was in his HOA, it meant that he owned half of my property. I think normally people would need to argue how they never agreed to join, but for me, that was not actually an issue. Like I said before, it was not actually an HOA, so they didn't have any rights about anything. In fact, him starting this thing just made him look worse and like he was trying to scam people. Because of him putting up the fence denying me access to my tools and animals, which in turn stopped me from earning any money and refusing to give me access, he ended up owing me $230,000. That was not the last thing that happened though. Since his little group was very clearly not legal, he was forced to get rid of this HOA because he had no right to take money from people or claim that he could go on their land. It was seen as kind of like a scam and the court did not want more people having issues with him. I was glad to have my farm back so I could at least attempt to get back into a normal life. I would have wanted to just give up, but I knew my wife would not have wanted me to do that. She would have wanted me to keep the farm and work hard and at least attempt to be happy with the rest of my life. The lawsuit and fight with the HOA president was actually a nice distraction from all the tragedy in my life, but I still could have gone without it. He does still live in the neighborhood, but since then has been very quiet and not drawn too much attention to himself since people know what a horrible person he is. And yeah guys, if you cannot get enough of my content, please don't forget to check out my podcast by searching for Ripe Stories on all major podcast platforms such as Spotify, Apple or Google Podcasts. Furthermore, you can find bonus content by going to patreon.com/ripeyoutube or by clicking the join button here on YouTube. For a small monthly fee, you will get access to dozens and dozens of exclusive videos you won't find anywhere else. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again tomorrow.